Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation and my 6-part review of the film adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comic book series. This is volume 4, Scott Pilgrim Gets It Together. If you've randomly come across this video on YouTube, welcome! I am the Dom, it's not an innuendo, it's just a poorly chosen name. This show is about discussing the loyalty of film adaptations to their source material, and if you'd like to start at the beginning of these Scott Pilgrim themed episodes, there's the thing. With so much less time being allotted to each book now, and as you're about to discover, so much of what is included being changed or moved around, the lines where one volume ends and another begins have started to get extremely blurry, so fair warning, my calculations are pretty much guesswork from here on. However, if we use the defeat of an evil X as markers, this volume makes up a mere 7% of the runtime, the shortest amount of time allotted to any of them, and that's counting Roxy's out-of-sequence appearance earlier in the film. This is unfortunate because I would be willing to say this is probably one of the most important books of the whole series, at least when it comes to the development of the main characters. It's also my personal favourite volume, but I suppose that's neither here nor there. Anyways, let's see what happened in the itty-bitty little bit of the film allotted to this volume. Ramona tries to offer Scott an out from going to the gig's after-party, as he seems to be sulking pretty bad after the Todd Envy fight, but he seems determined to still attend and sulk at the same time. He questions her on how she ended up with 7 evil exes, and she deflects by vaguely saying that all breakups have baggage and questioning him about Knives and Kim. Scott is dismissive of both, despite the pretty obvious signs that he badly damaged both women. Scott eventually apologizes for being an ass after Ramona calls him out on it, citing the stress of having to constantly kill people to be with her as the cause. Said stress is not helped by a surprise attack from his ninja friend from before. After a brief exchange, Scott learns that her name is Roxy, and finally catches on to the fact that she's Ramona's next ex. Roxy attempts to attack him, but Ramona intercedes, employing a huge hammer she pulls out of her small bag to drive Roxy off. After a really well choreographed, directed, and edited fight scene, Ramona is disarmed, but still seems to be winning the confrontation. Roxy informs her that if Scott isn't the one to defeat her, it won't count. Scott doesn't want to hit a girl, so Ramona grabs his arms and puppeteers him through the fight. This proves to be insufficient against Roxy's ninja powers, and Scott is punched so hard he dents the metal roof girders. Ramona tells him her weak spot is the back of her knee. Scott is confused but tries it, and Roxy orgasms so hard she dies. I know it was implied from the look on her face that Envy was aroused by the leg touch in the comic, but gosh, that was a tad less subtle. Let's look at what happened in the comic. Wow, that is, more blatant than most of the video game references in this, but okay, I'll roll with it. This comic starts at the height of Canadian summer, something I've actually experienced firsthand when I was there for a convention.
What is this? It's so hot!
Scott, Ramona, and their friend group are at the beach, apparently staying at Julie's aunt's seafront house. In the absence of a recent ex-attack, Ramona and Scott seem to be very happy together, though it seems Julie and Steven Stills are due for their 20th breakup, and Knives has finally stopped pretending to like young Neil. During a night of rampant alcohol consumption, Scott almost walks in on a drunken make-out session between Kim and Knives? Actually, this doesn't really lead to anything in the comic aside from outing these two as bisexual, and Kim as a bit of a hypocrite for bashing Scott for dating someone so much younger than him. Sometime later, when they're back in the city, Wallace mentions to Scott that they have to go and talk to their landlord about late rent payments soon. He's too nice to say it out loud, but supporting Scott's unemployed arse is clearly becoming a bit of a struggle for him. It's also apparently hot as balls and they don't have air conditioning. Wallace wants to know if Scott has managed to say the L word to Ramona yet, which of course Scott first assumes means lesbians. He apparently tried but bottled it because Ramona didn't seem to be into it. Kim, it seems, has press gang Scott and Steven Stills into helping her move in with Holly and Joseph, and while he's there, Steven Stills notices that Joseph has a home recording studio and talks him into helping Sex Bob-omb make their first album. Over lunch, Ramona and Scott are talking, and Scott is made to realize that, despite the amount of time they've been dating and his deep feelings for Ramona, there is actually a ton he doesn't know about her. Her age, for example. The next day, Wallace wakes Scott up by calling him from work and orders him to get the hell out of their heatsink apartment and go somewhere with air conditioning, or better yet, get a job at a place with air conditioning. Unsurprisingly, Scott opts for the first option and goes to the local mall, where he just happens to run into Lisa Miller, his long-lost friend from high school. She apparently grew up to be super hot and is wearing a short dress, which seems to hold Scott's attention to an uncomfortable level. They catch up and he invites her to hang out with the old crew while she's in town. Knives and her only friend outside of the Scott posse, Tamara, are discussing her latest teen angst, and Tamara asks why she defaced Scott's picture in her Scott shrine. Okay, yikes. Knives pleads ignorance about how that came to pass. Scott attempts to reintroduce Lisa to the group during band practice, but Stephen Stills apparently cancelled to start work on the album recording. Everyone else goes to a Tex-Mex place to catch up instead. Despite him acting suspiciously guilty about it, Ramona seems entirely unbothered by Scott spending so much time with his hot new old friend. The next morning, Ramona passes through Scott's dreams again and seems a little exasperated that he's making no attempt to find gainful employment after all this time. This is apparently the final push that Scott needed to get off his arse, and he spends the next day checking with his friends and family to see if there are any openings at their place of work. After a few false starts, he manages to get hired as a dishwasher at the vegetarian restaurant where Stephen Stills works. His jubilation over this only lasts so long as, on their way home, he and Kim are attacked by a mysterious Asian gentleman wielding a sword. Believing he might be the next evil X, but not wanting to fight someone armed with a bladed weapon, Scott uses a subspace door to escape him. In standard Scott Pilgrim comic logic, no one makes a big deal out of this near brush with swordy death. Okay, this is going to take all day at this rate, so let's do some rapid fire stuff. Scott goes home to find Wallace is having a sassy middle-of-the-day drinking party, Scott and Ramona hang out and discuss the Canadian summer, and Stephen Stills' obsession with making the album starts to enter slightly worrying levels, cancelling all practice sessions and gigs so Sixbomb can record. The complicated dynamic of their friend group is discussed at another hangout. Scott realises he forgot to tell Ramona he has a job now, and he's cock-blocked by a passed-out Wallace. Wallace, still the more responsible of the pair even when comatose drunk, mentions they have to get up early because they have to go and face their landlord the next day, and after preparing themselves for some royal arse-kissing, they are surprised to find out that they don't actually owe him any rent currently because their lease is up. They are suddenly faced with the choice of going month by month or moving out. This throws both of them into a bit of a dilemma, as if they are to cease being roommates, now would be the time, but neither had put any real thought into the possibility. Scott attempts to apply himself to his new job, but gets worn down by the uniquely torturous way that the catering industry somehow manages to be both hectic and monotonous at the same time in the most relatable panel of the entire series. Yes, I'm doing it again. I can't help it with Comic Scott. If it helps, at this point he's a completely different person to the Michael Cera version. On the way home, he's attacked by a phantom-like figure, presumably believing it to be the sword-wielding man from before Scott fights back, only to discover that this is a new attacker and a woman to boot. Horrified to discover he had unknowingly struck his opposite sex, he confesses he has no idea who she is. She doesn't enlighten him, and, apparently winded by his counter-strike, withdraws, swearing to return later. Okay, more rapid-fire stuff. Yet more recording of the album goes badly, Scott forgets to tell Ramona that he has a job again, everyone hangs out at the Tex-Mex place again because apparently this is their new go-to place now that band practice isn't a thing, and Lisa does appear to be low-key hitting on Scott whenever Ramona isn't around. Wallace tactfully broaches the idea of Scott moving in with Ramona when their lease is up, and Scott and Stephen Stills come across the mysterious male assailant again, prompting Scott to hide from him. Stephen Stills claims he can sort of remember the guy coming into the restaurant with his family, then they notice that Ramona and Scott's other mystery attacker are having lunch together. Scott reacts to this with about as much maturity as you might expect. It turns out this girl is named Roxanne Reacher, and after some increasingly obvious hints, Scott finally realizes she is the next evil X. With Scott unwilling to fight her, an exasperated Ramona tells him to hide in her bag and attempts to help him flee. Roxy pursues them and confronts her in a subspace tunnel they were trying to use to escape. Amusingly, the battle is resolved because Ramona accidentally hurts Roxy's feelings. Ramona explains that Roxy is a half ninja, half professional fine artist, and she has a gallery opening tonight in Toronto. She was going to go, but would rather hang out with Scott instead. Scott brings up the lease thing, and Ramona, apparently genuinely impressed that Scott is finally taking steps to get his life together, is the first to suggest it might be possible for him to move in with her. Later, at the Tex-Mex place again, you know, I didn't realize how often they go there until second reading. How do these guys afford to eat out every frickin' night? Ramona finally catches on to Lisa's obvious interest in Scott and grills him on their past and present relationship status on the way home. Scott doesn't handle the situation in the best of all possible ways, and Ramona storms off. Returning home in a foul mood, Scott is greeted by the sight of his roommate getting freaky with a random guy. Wallace apologizes, informs him he needs the apartment that night, and also tells him his boss called and he's fired. Homeless for the night, Scott realizes the only person who might be able to let him crash with them is Lisa. The irony of this appears to physically hurt him. Lisa confesses that she has in fact been dressing up all sexy and acting flirty with him due to a latent repressed sexual frustration left over from the fact that they never hooked up in in high school. And Scott seems to be pleased with this in principle, as it is a huge ego boost, but when Lisa suggests they actually do something about it, he apparently blacks out. Unfortunately, it turns out Roxy can invade his dreams just like Ramona, and she tries to kill him there. Lisa wakes him up just in time and reveals that they did not in fact hook up the night before. Scott proclaimed his undying love for Ramona, and they ate a lot of pizza together. Emboldened by the discovery that he's not a cheating bastard at heart anymore, Scott runs to find Ramona, then in a very surprising twist decides to go and try and get his job back first, working a full day before trying to sort out his love life. After work, he stops for coffee on the way to her house and is surprised to find that Knives is working there now, and infinitely more surprised to discover that the guy who's been trying to kill him all the way through the volume is her father. Knives theorizes that in the perfect storm of overprotectiveness and low-key racism, the discovery that Knives had dated an older white guy had caused her father's brain to break in half and be replaced with a mechanical engine of revenge. Scott's attempts to hide from Mr. Chow are unsuccessful, and he is forced to flee through another subspace door which leads him into Ramona's head. Her mind takes the form of some sort of throne room where she happily sits at the feet of some mysterious figure. She is horrified that he witnessed this and forcefully ejects him back into the physical world. Once out, she calms down and realizes that being mad at him for this would be a tad hypocritical. She also tries to apologize to him for being a bit of a butt in regards to Lisa, though Scott's confession that he crashed at her place the night before really seems to hit her hard. She asks if Scott is in love with Lisa. Scott is just about to put her straight on the matter when he discovers that Roxy is staying with Ramona while she's in town trying to kill him. Unable to process this latest development, Scott stumbles around the street in a weird, vibrant color haze. He's then, without any explanation, confronted with the Naga Scott. Scott screams that he doesn't need him, he needs Ramona, and starts to run back to her. However, everyone's emotional turmoil has to be put aside at this point as Ramona is blasted out the door by Mr. Chow. You know a situation is bad when the arrival of a sword-wielding assassin actually improves matters. Scott leads him away from Ramona and distracts him by running to Roxy, who mistakes him for another agent sent by Gideon and attacks him out of indignation. She quickly realizes her mistake while Scott hides in the bathtub and shames him for not fighting his own battle. Ramona seems to concur with her, and once again, all it takes is a single comment from her to compel Scott to turn his life around. Manning up, he tells Ramona he loves her and they can make it work if they try. This grants him the power of love, personified and weaponized as a sword. Mr. Chow, following some sort of code of honor, steps aside to allow him to fight his true enemy, and Scott takes Roxy down in a single attack. She is sliced clean in two and, explodes into bunnies instead of coins for some reason. Before dying, she mentions Scott must face the twins next, which is a bit of a shock, but he rolls with it. Scott tries to explain himself to Mr. Chow, but it seems that fighting with honor was already enough to convince him that he didn't try any funny business with his daughter, so he withdraws. Ramona says she loves him too, and she barely made out with Roxy at all. Scott apparently chooses to ignore the latter and celebrates the former. They decide to move in together slightly later, which Wallace reveals is very lucky for Scott because he had already secretly decided to move in with Mobile ages ago, so Scott would have been totally screwed if he'd wanted to stay. Mr. Chow confirms to Knives that he's okay with the idea of her dating white guys now. Steven Stills continues down his path into madness trying to get this album finished, and they throw a goodbye party for Lisa as she moves to LA to pursue her career as an actress. Scott finally finds out how old Ramona is, and the comic ends on a genuinely touching moment between them. The Dom's final thoughts. So, as you can see, the comics have now gone almost half a year, while the film is still just a few days long. Adaptation-wise, this sort of change can be a bit of a mixed bag, with many advantages to it, but also many consequences that come with it. Examples of both will hopefully be apparent by the end of these reviews. Despite passing over the events of Volume 4 almost completely, the film included homages to events from other volumes, like the ones I mentioned in the last episode, and they even reference the bonus extra material you get with the colour version of Volume 3, where Ramona helps Scott through a fight against the girl he doesn't want to hit. Likewise, imagery from this volume is used later in the film, like Scott pulling a sword out of his chest, bonking his head against a lamppost at night, and Ramona sitting subserviently next to Gideon's throne. Or the volume borrowed the imagery from the film. I guess we're finally at the point where I can't even say that I suspect the comic came first. I have no idea from here on. Like I said at the start, for Scott at least, this volume was probably the single most important comic character arc-wise. The part where Scott chooses to prioritize his crappy job over talking things out with his girlfriend is probably one of the single biggest character development moments in the series, and it's presented, somewhat amazingly, amazingly without any major fuss or unnecessary explanatory dialogue. The fact that Scott is making a mature adult decision is pretty groundbreaking. He's doing something he really doesn't want to do instead of immediately dropping everything and trying to fix the thing that's clearly super important to him. Remember that in the first 3 books he prioritized getting with Ramona so far above things like his friends, his responsibilities, and anyone who might get hurt in the process, they hardly even registered to him as things that existed. Now he's prepared to delay making up with her to work a job he hates because that's just something you have to do sometimes as an adult. To be completely honest, I think him working up the courage to say I love you at the end is kind of small potatoes in comparison. The absence of this sort of character development in the film is one of my greatest issues with this adaptation, though once again I'm afraid I must come back to this later in the final thoughts once we've had a chance to look at the whole thing. The way this story portrays the Roxy-Ramona friendship combined with the Roxy-Scott death battle is one of the main reasons I love this series and this volume in particular. O'Malley did what I consider to be an amazing job of exploring what life would be like in a world where death in combat is little more than an inconvenience for certain people and not something anyone should get too upset about. In regards to the brief appearance of the Naga Scott, this was something that was apparently intended to be included but was eventually banished to the deleted scenes of the film, which contented itself of just acknowledging the concept of inverse copies of people in video games early on. The intention was, evidently, for him to show up whenever Scott was feeling particularly guilty about his selfish and hurtful behaviour, which means the Naga Scott represented a whole different sort of symbolism in the film than he did in the comic. I'll talk more about this after his most significant appearance in Volume 6. Once again, in this volume, the battle with the X is pushed to the background and is used as one of several things that drive the plot instead of being the plot like in the film. Mr. Chow is probably the thing I would have most liked to have seen in the film, though his omission is totally understandable with the runtime constraints they were working with. I mean, Roxy's entire storyline got compressed to pretty much a single line.
I'm a little five.
I must confess, it never occurred to me to question why Ramona would be on board with playing by Gideon's rules when it came to the League of Evil X's until the comic itself drew attention to it in Volume 3, but once it was in question, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I mean, granted, Scott wouldn't really have much choice but to defend himself if they tried to attack and kill him, but why can't Ramona fight with him against Matthew, Lucas, or Todd, or try to kill Roxy on her own if she wants to? I mean, if she were to poof her into coins, what would Gideon do about it? What consequences could there possibly be for her that he doesn't try and do anyway? As you can see, this volume would have been in-name only even if I wasn't already doing these reviews in that format. All in all, even though this is my favourite volume, I don't think I would whine about its absence in the film even if I could definitively say it was completed before the script was finalised. There's certainly bits of it that might have improved the final product, but all in all, it's just telling a much longer story than would fit into a film. It's a good story, but it would be an adaptation nightmare. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. I just want to say that I am deeply appreciative of all the assistance I've received so far combating the unforgiving algorithm abomination of YouTube. Liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing really does make a huge difference to the performance of these videos, so if you did like it, please don't be afraid to show it. See you soon. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that. A mysterious but handsome wizard wearing sunglasses informed me you're spending the money on a cannon designed to allow you to shoot puppies into the sun, and I have no reason to assume whoever that was making it up for his own amusement. Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and and I will see you in the next episode.